It's been a new day in Ukraine for some time, so I would hope that the EU could fast track membership for them. I don't think that's as threatening to Moscow as NATO membership is, and it's particularly if you're going to deploy NATO troops along that border. But again, that's something to be negotiated. If I was a Ukrainian, I'd want ironclad or as close to ironclad guarantees of my security as possible. And how you secure that is going to be where the devil is, because those are the details. And again, Ukraine's going to actually have two sets of negotiations, to be very clear. They're going to have a negotiation with Russia to settle the war, and then they're going to have a negotiation with Europe and NATO in order to figure out how Ukraine can live in a Western economic zone, a Western security zone.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by Ambassador Mitchell Rees, a former Director of Policy Planning at the US State Department and a former US Special Envoy to Northern Ireland. Ambassador, welcome to Frontline.
Great, thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Wanted to start by talking about the events of the past week. It's hard to ignore the outcome of the US presidential election. There has been so much said about what Donald Trump may or may not do with regards American support for Ukraine. What is your sense of how he's likely to approach things?
Well, I think it's always prudent to be very cautious in interpreting anything that President Trump says, especially on the campaign trail, as gospel. I think he says a lot of things. Some of it is simply to test out certain ideas. Others are provocative, perhaps on purpose. On Ukraine, he's actually said a lot of things, and most of the more controversial ones have been reported, such as he'll end the conflict in a day. But he's also had a lot more thoughtful comments about it and what it would take to end this terrible conflict and how he believes it should come to a conclusion as soon as possible for the benefit of everyone.
So when, for example, he said that comment about I could end the war in 24 hours, should we discount that? I mean, it's been widely seen that he is more skeptical about support for Ukraine than the Biden administration has been. Or do you think that is purely a bluff and that he may actually turn out to be more supportive of Ukraine than many people think?
I think it's actually neither. I think he's indicating or signaling, if you will, by these statements that he believes that he is perhaps uniquely able to bring an end to this conflict. I think that he feels that he should have won the Nobel Peace Prize for the Abraham Accords in his first term. I think he sees this as a vehicle for him ending a conflict and winning the Nobel Peace Prize, something that was given to President Obama but was denied to him. So I think that he is actually a little bit more thoughtful about what it's going to take. He knows that it takes compromise on both sides. And as far as the Biden administration, let's remember that President Trump actually released weapons to Ukraine that the Obama administration had prevented, including Javelin anti-tank weapons. He placed sanctions on Russia when he was president, and he opposed Germany's Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline to Russia because it would make Germany overly dependent on Russia for energy security. So I think if you look at the full record, you'll see that he hasn't exactly been a pushover for Mr. Putin.
One of the ideas that reportedly is on the table that Trump and his advisors are looking at is this idea of a demilitarized zone between Russia and Ukraine, a bit like you have between North and South Korea. Do you think that is feasible?
Well, that's an idea I think that General Kellogg had aired earlier this year. It's difficult, let's put it this way. It's not quite North and South Korea. You have 1,200 kilometers as where the battle lines currently are that you'd have to demilitarize. So that's a very long border that would have to be patrolled. Where would the demilitarized zone consist of? Would it come from the territory you're going to cede to Russia? Would it come from additional Ukrainian territory? Who is going to make sure that the peace is kept in that demilitarized zone? How are you going to verify that it's being kept in that zone? What's the mechanism for trying to resolve any issues that arise because of it? So these are extremely complicated details. To be honest, I don't think anybody, whether in the United States or Europe or even Ukraine, has thought through all the implications right now.
I was speaking to someone earlier, a Times journalist who covers the war in Ukraine, and he said that if this idea of a demilitarized zone would probably at the moment appeal more to Kyiv than it would to Moscow because Ukraine are anxious. They might be in a mood now to freeze the front lines because of the advances that Russia are making. But from Moscow's point of view, they would be more reluctant because, as you say, Ambassador, there is this issue of, well, who would be patrolling it? Who would be policing it? And if you had, say, NATO troops in land bordering Russia, you can understand why Vladimir Putin would consider that a non-starter.
Well, it's a truism. It's going to take both sides to make compromises. If Russia feels that it has the upper hand and doesn't need to compromise now, then it'll continue to pursue the fighting. I think the Ukrainians have been remarkably brave and courageous in fending off a much larger country. And so it's unclear exactly where both sides are psychologically in terms of wanting to end this right now. But again, it's all on the question of whose terms are going to prevail, who has the greatest amount of leverage. And again, here's where the United States can come into play. President Trump has said that if Putin doesn't agree to compromise, he will arm Ukraine to the teeth, and he will back them with all the might that the United States has. So again, an issue where he's probably trying to create some leverage, trying to see what the response might be. But the truism is it's going to take compromise on both sides and a willingness to do that. And right now, we don't have that present.
It's interesting you say that Trump has hinted that he might be prepared to, as you say, arm Ukraine to the teeth if Russia's not in a mood to compromise. I mean, this issue of US military aid to Ukraine is a very live one, obviously, and Donald Trump Jr. shared a post on social media over the weekend that showed President Zelensky of Ukraine with a caption on it saying, "Points of view, you're 38 days from losing your allowance," implying somehow that America might cut off military aid to Ukraine. What do you make of both Donald Trump Jr. sharing such a post, but also the issue of whether Trump will continue military aid for Ukraine?
Well, last I checked, Donald Trump Jr. doesn't have a position in this administration. He's certainly entitled to his opinion. And there are people within the president's circle who believe that. J.D. Vance, perhaps most notedly. But there are also others who believe that Ukraine's fight is our fight. It's Europe's fight. It's a fight for certain values that we believe in and should be defended. And it's also a fight that we know that China is watching. And so it's not just what happens in Ukraine, but it's about restoring American deterrence in Asia and across the Middle East, because we've seen recently what happens when Iran becomes emboldened and Hamas and Hezbollah go on the rampage. So I think that it's a little bit more complicated than just saying your allowance is up. And there's one other factor. I think the president will be impressed by the fact that 80 to 90% of all American aid to Ukraine is actually benefiting American workers and American manufacturers. So this actually is something that helps us economically in terms of ginning up the military machine that we need to compete in a dangerous world. So again, I just think that we ought to take with a grain of salt, a large shaker of salt perhaps, what President Trump has been saying so far.
And as ever with any administration, I'm sure there will be some internal division over what the correct approach should be towards Ukraine. Do you think for those who want to continue arming Ukraine, do you think the best argument to take to President Trump is almost to put it in that wider geopolitical context, that it's in China's interest for Russia to do well, that it's in Iran's interest for Ukraine to fail? Do you think, therefore, if it's put in those terms, President Trump may be more sympathetic to the Ukrainian cause?
Well, I think we've seen that President Trump is not cut from the same cloth that most American presidents have been since the end of the Second World War. He doesn't really believe in the international order that the United States constructed and has led for the last half century plus. I think he sees his intervention as something more personal and something more transactional. So I think the best arguments for supporting Ukraine are going to be how they can benefit the United States, how they can benefit his presidency. And again, if he can broker a deal that's sustainable, that preserves Ukraine's sovereignty, that enhances European security, that enhances deterrence in Asia and across the Middle East, then I think he'll feel that he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. And guess what? He will.
It sounds almost, Ambassador, that you are more optimistic about Donald Trump's likely approach to Ukraine than a lot of Ukraine supporters are.
Well, I'd like to be cautiously optimistic, let's put it that way. It doesn't do a lot of good to be pessimistic in life, I found. I think that there are arguments, as you mentioned, that can be made for the president and for other people in his administration, because you're right, there are going to be divisions, there'll be a wide variety of opinions expressed. But I think that he's also going to want to see the Europeans step up in a major way. This was a theme of his first term, where only 3 countries in 2014 were hitting the NATO goal of 2% of their GDP. Now it's 2/3, but frankly, that means a third aren't, and 2% doesn't look nearly as sufficient as it did, 10 years ago, given the international environment. So I think it's going to be part of a broader conversation he's going to have with the Europeans, and of course, you then fold in trade, and it's going to make for a pretty heady cocktail. But I am not pessimistic at all. I do think that the United States will support Ukraine under President Trump, but I do think that every war must end, and this one is going to end in a negotiated arrangement, and I think that he is very well placed to actually help lead that effort.
What do you think an acceptable negotiated settlement might look like from a Ukrainian perspective? I've heard some people say it may involve the ceding of some sovereign territory, potentially Crimea and parts of the east, in exchange for future security guarantees, be that NATO membership, membership of the EU, or some other kind of security agreement.
Well, let me state first, I think it's for the Ukrainians to articulate their own position. But let's do this. Let's set out a maximalist position from the Ukrainians. They would want all of their territory restored, including Crimea. They would want a pathway to EU membership, and they would want a pathway to NATO membership as quickly as possible. They'd want security guarantees if NATO membership wasn't available immediately until it could be available. And they'd want economic assistance to help rebuild their country. Okay, that's what we would like if an ideal situation. That is probably unattainable. So now the question is, what can you achieve realistically with less than that? And how much territory do you need to cede? Is EU membership on the table? How long will that take? Is NATO membership on the table? And how long will that take? And in the interim, are there any security guarantees? And again, how can you stabilize the border with Russia in the interim until Ukraine does become a NATO member? And again, all these complexities about how long the border is, who the peacekeeping forces are going to be, how you're going to verify it, what weapons are you going to allow Ukraine to possess, if that's going to be part of the negotiation also. Is there going to be basically zones of demilitarized? So yes, there's going to be a deconfliction point like the DMZ in North and South Korea, but is there going to be areas where neither side can have advanced weapons that could threaten the other? So again, lots of possibilities. The key is, how can you make Ukraine more secure, more safe, and over the long term prosperous while maintaining its sovereignty so that this doesn't happen again in another 5 or 10 or 15 years?
Well, on that point, what would be your response, Ambassador, to the argument that a lot of Ukraine supporters make, which is that if there's any kind of negotiated peace that involves the long-term ceding of sovereign Ukrainian territory to Vladimir Putin's Russia, that the Kremlin will sell that as a win, and that in 5 or 10 years' time, some point down the line, it'll be back, be it in Ukraine or in the Baltic states?
That's right. That's exactly the concern. So how do you know that they just don't reboot and rearm and we have at this again? Where they attack Ukraine. And again, there's no guarantees, unfortunately, but there are things that you can do in order to make that less likely. And so this is where integrating Ukraine as much as possible into a security architecture that would deter Russia from aggression again is absolutely essential. And again, how you do that, what type of architecture, what the mechanisms are, what the timing is, that's really where the diplomacy is going to need to take place.
And just taking, for example, that sort of shopping list that you laid out of the best case scenario Ukraine might want, Of those options, which do you think are the most realistic? Is it, for example, a pathway to EU and NATO membership?
Well, I certainly think that Ukraine should have had a pathway to EU membership years ago. They had all sorts of internal problems with corruption, a lack of transparency and accountability. I think it's been a new day in Ukraine for some time, so I would hope that the EU could fast track membership for them. I don't think that's as threatening to Moscow as NATO membership is, and it's particularly if you're going to deploy NATO troops along that border. But again, that's something to be negotiated. If I was a Ukrainian, I'd want ironclad or as close to ironclad guarantees of my security as possible. And how you secure that is going to be where the devil is, because those are the details. And again, Ukraine's going to actually have two sets of negotiations, to be very clear. They're going to have a negotiation with Russia to settle the war, and then they're going to have a negotiation with Europe and NATO in order to figure out how Ukraine can live in a Western economic zone, a Western security zone. And those are two separate negotiations. Obviously, they're related, but that's part of what makes this such a complicated diplomatic dance.
Understandably, so much of the conversation around Ukraine and Russia at the moment focuses on Donald Trump and what he's likely to do when he takes office in January. But of course, there are still 2 months of the Biden administration to go. Do you think we will see any major announcements with regards to Ukraine in the coming months? According to reports, Keir Starmer and President Macron of France may try and persuade the Biden administration one more time to allow Ukraine to use long range Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles on targets inside Russia. Do you think we may see some movement there or elsewhere?
Well, if they haven't been able to persuade them for the last 2 years, it's hard to see how they're going to persuade them in the last 2 months of this administration. I think that's been part of Ukraine's frustration, is that the delivery of arms has been slow, and those that have come are not the more lethal weapons that they believe they need and deserve in order to defend themselves. So I don't see a great deal of change coming from European instigation. I have read earlier today that the Biden administration is going to make sure that all the weapons that have been promised will be shipped by January 20th. So that perhaps is something. I know that the U.S. is now sending technicians over there to help repair systems for the Ukrainians. That's long overdue in my view. But I think that we're going to have to wait and see what the president wants to do, who his Secretary of State will be, who his Secretary of Defense will be. We don't know those positions yet. In Washington, the aphorism is that personnel is policy. And so we'll see what views those individuals might have. But, this 75, 76-day interregnum between the election and January 20th is a little bit fraught, a little bit more anxious than normal, because there is a lack of government authority now. This administration is on the way out. People are cleaning up their resumes, looking for other jobs. Other people are trying to move in as quickly as possible, but they don't have any government authority yet. So it is an opportunity for folks around the world to misbehave. I just watch this space, but I don't think there's going to be any major changes on the ground in the next 70 days or so.
And just finally, to return to that point about a potential timeline for a peace agreement or a negotiated settlement of some kind, how long do you think it might take? I mean, okay, take it with a pinch of salt when Donald Trump talks about 24 hours and he can end this war. But do you think within the first few months of him taking office, we may see a major breakthrough? Or do you think in a year's time, we will still very much be talking about fighting in Ukraine?
Well, again, it takes two to tango, so a lot of it's going to depend on what Russia and Ukraine want to do. I think it's possible to have a ceasefire within a relatively short period of time, certainly within the first 6 months of the Trump administration. Then working out the details while that ceasefire is preserved could take a year or probably longer. So I think it may happen in phases if it's going to happen. But I do think it's possible that there should be a ceasefire by the middle of this coming year.
Ambassador Mitchell Rees, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, James.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.